We're joined today by Helen Pluckrose. Helen is the editor of Areo magazine, the author of a forthcoming book called Cynical Theories, and has been on the channel, I think, in a couple of different films, but mainly the one was, I think, Impossible Conversations and Fighting Postmodernism from the Left. And I thought it was very timely for Helen to come on. I'm glad she made the time. I know you're really busy at the moment, Helen, so thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on. It's nice to have a conversation with people.
Yeah, I mean, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of kind of social justice ideology, and the piece I wanted to sort of start off. I'll ask the first question, and then we'll go to the questions from the other people on the call. But I wanted, because I rewatched the piece Fighting Postmodernism from the Left, and I was struck in that by how much you said it was really important that some of the pushback to sort of extreme social justice ideology came from the left because it was so easily weaponized by the right. And I wanted to pick up on that and ask you where you think we're at right now. There was a piece that was published actually today, I think. What was it called? Drawing a Line or something? The piece that, what's the...
Oh, we got two out today. What, an Areo?
No, I think it was, there was an article in The Spectator, and it was also...
Oh, yes, that one. That was a joint letter. I was asked to sign that, and I agreed with every single bit of it, so that was quite easy for me to do. I liked the way it said we need to push back at the reactionary right and the culture warriors on the left and stop making everything such a focus on race, stop evaluating people by race. Sometimes people think that means ignore racism, but that doesn't follow at all. If we can just come at it from this universal liberal standpoint, I think we're just going to do a lot better than this intense ideological focus on identity factors.
And where do you feel we're at now, Helen? Sort of, obviously, what, 8 months, 12 months on from when we recorded that, we had this sort of sense of, at the beginning, there was this sort of idea of the virus has killed woke. And now we're in a very, very different place, even like a couple of weeks on. Where are you feeling we're at? I mean, it's obviously quite timely for your book.
Yeah, it is, yeah. But I keep getting optimistic and then losing all hope, and so much of it depends on who I'm talking to at the moment and who's writing to me. So I still think it could go either way. First of all, I started getting a lot of people, liberal lefties, who'd said to me that I was exaggerating the problem, it wasn't a big deal, and I was getting messages from them saying, okay, I can see this is illiberal now, I will help you push back at this. Then that kind of died off, and I was starting to think, no, what's going to happen now is we're going to get a pushback from the populist right, that will wake the liberal lefts up, and then they will do that. But things are going to get worse before they get better. We could lose a lot of progress on gender, racial, LGBT equality that way. But I'm now becoming a lot more hopeful again, because people are writing to me, they're joining my Discord server, they're everything from Marxists to conservatives, but their focus is on maintaining the liberal order of not evaluating people by their identity and treating everybody the same and equal opportunities. So I'm hopeful it could happen from the liberal left, but I'm not completely confident.
So is Amanda on the call? Amanda Sutari? Doesn't look like she is. No. But I'm going to read her question out because it got the most upvotes of a question. So she's saying, I've been dismayed recently by what seems like a dramatic increase in the past weeks on my social media feed of conspirituality. Spirituality-oriented friends wholesale adopting QAnon conspiracies. I understand it's likely due to QAnon conspiracies, Trumpism, Fox News. I understand it's likely due to some critiques of some of the rigidities of the political left. However, they seem to be falling into what integralists call the pre-trans fallacy. Instead of adopting a post-progressive perspective by critiquing those blind spots and transcending and including the previous cultural stages, they're instead uncritically identifying with the tribalist far right as their answer to pushing back on the left. I wonder if you could speak to this, and if you have any suggestion about how to engage with this in a way that does not create further polarization.
Okay, well, there was quite a lot of references to things I'm not quite sure about in that, but was the general gist of it that she's seeing a lot of people buying into right-wing populist narratives?
Yeah, and conspiracy narratives. I
Yeah.
guess the key point in that is how do you argue back against some of these issues without creating more polarization and more tribalization?
I think the sort of psychologist writing about conspiracy theories essentially said we can't. There isn't a way. Once you're in that mentality, anything which seems to deny it proves it. So it's kind of like a mirror image of this white fragility thing, where denying that you are fragile is evidence that you're fragile. And I think we're seeing this on both sides at the moment. And we're getting a bit sort of into the weeds a bit, but we've been coming towards calling what we're in now the late state of late postmodernism, the age of narratives, because that's what we've really seen in the last couple of years. I mean, since Trump, but before Trump, but really escalating now, is it doesn't really matter what's true anymore. People like Trump will say something and then deny that he said that, even though he's being recorded saying it. I'm seeing people on social media suddenly change their story, deny what they were saying, shift about, and they can do this. And this is academics quite a lot of the time, even though people can see what they're doing, because it doesn't matter anymore. There isn't this thing where you're trying to win an argument on reason or anything else. There's this, I am building this narrative. If you make a move, then I'll make a move against you. How can I frame that? And that, I think, is what we're seeing at the moment. And I'm not sure how to come back from this at all. But both sides, I mean, one of my most popular writers, Matt McManus, is calling it postmodern conservatism, because that's exactly what we're seeing. People weaving narratives around themselves. Other people in the group may even know that it isn't true, but it doesn't matter, because truth isn't, objective reality isn't the option. It's much more about what we can weave around ourselves. That how to talk back to that, I don't know. I really don't know how to, when someone's really embedded in a narrative, apart from, just trying to connect with them as people and trying to sort of build some bridges. But with getting through to the argument, I think the best we can do is try and stop the people who haven't got there yet from getting there.
I'm just going to ask a follow-up, because you mentioned the Discord server that you've set up where that's mainly for people who are being threatened with, who are worried about their jobs or worried about kind of initiatives at work to connect with each other. And you mentioned just before the call that you were writing a letter. So I'd be interested to, I think that's one angle of like, what strategies are you advising people who are concerned about an ideology and how to kind of frame their response to it?
At the moment, I think, because a lot of people are quite daunted because they don't understand very well how it works. It just looks as though it's racist, particularly with the sort of white privilege, whiteness, white fragility thing. It just seems to say that all white people are racist, therefore it's essentializing some kind of badness to white people. And so they want to push back at that and say that is actually racist. I'm not being racist, but that is racist. But you have to get a better understanding of how it works. I mean, you can still refute it once you have, but just trying to get in there. And with people like DiAngelo, when we've got white fragility, or we've got Layla Saad, or even Ibram Kendi, although he's not quite in the same category, they are really, really easily readable. If you read one of these books, you can see how an average person who may not even have studied anything like this at college can really sort of take on this mentality, and it's seductive because then everything is explained. It is very much like that kind of conspiracy theory. So I am trying to advise people not to push back, as the tendency is to push back on the liberal thing, saying you are judging me, this is inconsistent, and actually, but but not do that so much, and instead show some familiarity with how the theories work. They work with this idea that whiteness is an invisible force which is perpetuated by all the interactions and everything that is said by white people. White people themselves may not be aware of it, they usually aren't, but everything that they say and the way that everything they understand as knowledge functions to keep non-white people down. So if you get into this idea of discourse theory, it comes from Foucault in the first place, where he's saying we've got powerful groups in society, they have the power to say what is knowledge. Once something is accepted as knowledge, people on all levels of society perpetuate it by speaking into it. So if we can actually get that that is how it works, the problem there that you can push back at is that it's assuming that human beings don't have agency to look at these ideas themselves. There are only certain people who can see it, these people that are known as the woke, or in the academic language, critical consciousness. They can see it, but they assume that nobody else can, and so it needs to be explained to people. And this is what's happening when we're seeing the kind of diversity training that we're getting at the moment. The trainer is coming in with the assumption that the people there will not realize that they are racist, that they've internalized these ideas, that they're perpetuating them, and they have to teach them that. They're expecting resistance because there's this theory, mostly from DiAngelo, which says that white people find this absolutely intolerable, to be told that they are complicit in racism, and they will push back. So this is just all set up in the first place to make it very, very difficult to argue with. And what people tend to do is try to argue with it on its own terms, and that just gets you tied up in knots. So you need to go right to the center of it and to say, I don't accept discourse analysis. I know that culture has a huge influence. I still believe that people can evaluate certain ideas. I believe that people can think about racism. They can decide not to be racist. They may have some assumptions. They can look at them themselves. We don't need to be taught this blanket simplistic theory. It's not helping anything.
So I'm going to ask Matthias Vollmer. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. I'll maybe try and paraphrase a bit. So I've noticed that sometimes we speak of those on the extreme left, or we speak of the postmodernists as if it's a sort of homogenous group. But I guess there's going to be a certain amount of people who are following out of shame. There may be a certain amount of people who are following because they somehow feel they're on the side of justice, but they don't really understand critical theory, let's say. There may be those who understand critical theory, but they don't see that its logic, it's kind of flawed the way they discard actual science, for example. And then I'm wondering whether there are those people who really understand critical theory for what it is, and they just use it as a power tool. And I'm curious to what degree you would, in what proportions you would put people into those different categories. And maybe specifically, if we're talking about somebody like DiAngelo, does she really believe the kind of information she spreads? Or is she just using it shamelessly as a tool to advance some sort of own agenda to, I don't know, gain more power herself or something like that?
Okay, well, I have a speculation about DiAngelo herself. Obviously, I cannot know exactly what is going on inside her head, but from the amount of stuff I have read and watched from her, I believe that she is 100% sincere in what she believes. And I think that most people are. I also think that we should assume that they are, unless there is really, really strong evidence that they aren't, because we have got to do a battle on this level of ideas. There are people who will accuse me of being racist, or of being financially motivated, or all of these other things too, in order so they don't actually have to engage with my ideas. And I think when it comes to someone like DiAngelo, I strongly suspect that she suffers from something like scrupulosity, a form of OCD, where she's got this real, she's sort of thought herself into this framework, this sort of frame of mind where she's become aware of some racial biases she's got herself, and she's built this great theory around it. And I think this is much more common than people realize it is. So I'm not saying everybody is mentally ill, but it appeals to something in people. If you look at how Christianity has appealed to something in people, where they've thought, I am flawed and I can work on myself and I can try to get better. And that is something that we're seeing from DiAngelo. Obviously, I can't be diagnosing people that I haven't met when I'm not even a psychologist, but there's a really unhealthy kind of psychology going on there, but it has been popular. I don't know how many people are opportunists. I'm sure there are some. We probably should assume that they're not, and actually try to get at the ideas, which are sort of held on different levels, because the number of people who are reading Foucault, Derrida, are really tiny, I should imagine. But the number of people who are reading DiAngelo and Sartre and Kendi, this is much more accessible. If you are a young idealistic person who wants to make the world a better place, these are books you can read in a couple of days. You can absorb it all quickly. You can get imbued with a sense of purpose. And that I think explains an awful lot of the activist movement. And then far more than that, though, there is this larger larger group of people, probably a majority on the left and to the centre, who want to be doing the right thing. Social justice sounds like a good thing. They're looking at the problem on the right and they're thinking, well, this is what we need to be opposing. Perhaps there are some lunatics and they're going a bit too far on this side, but we need some solidarity. So they're pushing back at the right, when what we really need them to be doing is taking apart the ideas of people like DiAngelo and saying, we all want to end racism, we all want to oppose racism. This is not substantiated by any evidence. This is based on the implicit bias test, which has been almost entirely debunked now. It's based on a really theoretical assumption where DiAngelo has taken what seems like the contents of her own mind and generalized them onto the rest of the population. And it's appealed to enough people that that's become a kind of movement, but we need to try and push back at that and argue for, well, I would say, I am a left liberal, so I will always be arguing for our common humanity and our individuality, and pushing back at it from that way. And this will, I think, will work out so much better than if we end up having a pushback from a populist right, which is anti-intellectual, is anti-equality in some ways. So we've got to try and wake the liberals up to it. So that was a bit of a monologue.
No, that was great.
Did I answer all of that?
Matthias, did you have a...
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a little follow-up, just because we were just talking before, Helen, about, I had a sense over the last 2 years that things were really starting to shift. Like, more and more of my sort of progressive friends had come to me and said, like, often privately, and sort of said, I didn't realize, and now I get it. So I was seeing this move in the direction of at least being aware that there were sort of dangers to the left as well as dangers to the right. And so I'm still really surprised at how quickly it seems to have kind of resurged now. So, I mean, how are you seeing it sort of over the last 2 years, and then when we're at now, where we're at now?
Okay, I'd like to sort of go a bit further if I could, because I think it helps to see the progression of this, because we had the original postmodernists in the late 60s, and they were writing these very deconstructive ideas. Objective truth is not really a thing. It's all language, it's all power, pull it all apart. Now, this kind of destroyed itself by about 1989. In 1989, there was a burst of saying, come on, we need to do something with this. These power structures are real. They're the objective truth. Now let's work out how to go forwards with them. Then about 2010, it's suddenly started to get much, much more solid and much simpler. So whereas in the first generation, the uninitiated could probably not make out a word, in the second generation, it's still dense. Butler is no different to the postmodernist. It's still very esoteric and jargony. But if you look at what's happened since 2010, it has got so simple, so clear, so absolutist that it could be read by a 10-year-old and understood. Robin DiAngelo, in particular, she speaks in words of absolute certainty, and she could be read by a junior school child and taken in. So this means that it's a good thing in a way, because we can get at the ideas now. They're not hiding them behind obscurantist language. But we've seen an escalation really rapidly from about 2015, where more and more people have taken on these ideas. We've had diversity, equity, and inclusion as an industry has built up. So it's been really gathering speed from about 2015. Then when we had the election of Donald Trump, it's kind of gone into overdrive, and it's convinced the people who thought that there was this racist, sexist, colonialist undercurrent going through everything all the time, that actually is the case. That's why we've got Donald Trump. So in the last few years, it's got harder and harder for liberal lefties who really wanted to give the benefit of the doubt to the social justice movement to ignore the fact that it really isn't liberal. So I'm not surprised you have had more people saying to you, okay, I can see it now. We can all see it now. It's getting harder and harder not to see it now. And I think, yes, in the last 2 years, that's when it's kind of, that, I think that is the fastest moving time of it. So I think we've come to a head now, and I think it's going to get pushed back in the next few months, and we just have to try and work out how we can get it to be pushed back in a healthy way.
Yeah, we'll see. And are you anticipating that your book will get quite a lot of pickup as well?
I think it will. We've had, our publisher has taken pre-orders for it and given us figures that I don't understand, but he says that there's quite a lot. The various booksellers are expecting quite a high demand for it. So that's good.
Yeah. So, Jochen, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much, Helen, for being here today. Yeah, I'm curious. Two things. One is maybe, and I don't know how much you know about Ken Wilber's integral theory, but is there still something that we can learn from postmodernism that we can take almost to the next level? Was there anything useful that came out of this at all? And I'm specifically asking, so I think that on the more hard sciences side, philosophy of science, I see one of the biggest problems at the moment, let's say replication crisis, and like this idea of making very linear cause and effect scenarios, having a simple hypothesis, testing something. And in this one experiment, it works, but it doesn't work in the larger context because we don't really understand complex systems, and that we really need some improved philosophy of actual science to really set against this, that would then also help us to explain such complex things as, you know, people coming up with a theory and putting it out, and they're getting some reward from that, and then there's feedback. So this entire mechanism by which things actually get going, for which we don't have a good science yet, it seems to me, or at least the science is fairly incomplete in a description that's the scientific language of complex systems and feedbacks that is actually taught to people in school and university.
Yeah, well, I think if we go to what is the thing of value in postmodernism, and that comes down to the skepticism of meta-narratives. So this is not entirely wrong, of course, because there was an overconfidence in modernity. There was this thing, we're always going to progress, we're getting more and more enlightened, it's all reason, science, evidence, liberalism, you know, it's going beautifully. And that was quite overconfident. But when we're looking at postmodernism as a skeptical system, it doesn't work because it's indiscriminately skeptical. So if you have a good scientific skepticism, then you're skeptical about a certain thing. You're asking how you can be sure that thing is true. You're trying to find ways to prove that it isn't true. But if you've got postmodern skepticism, there simply aren't any categories, there aren't any ways to find out whether something is true or false. That isn't even the aim. The aim is much more of, well, what power systems have gone into this? Why do we believe, for example, that men are more interested in average than women in technology? What purpose does that serve? So they will stay in this fog of not knowing, and they will theorize politically while claiming that objective knowledge is out of reach. So this skepticism is valuable, this skepticism towards meta-narratives, but I would point out that we'd actually managed to oppose quite a few of them before postmodernism arose. We'd had secularism, we'd overturned patriarchy, feudalism, imperialism. All of these grand narratives, they had died. When Francois Lyotard said there's a skepticism towards a meta-narrative, that's a recognition that society had been too straightforward, it had been too confident in itself. So I don't know what the solution would be to problems in science. I'm pretty sure it's not postmodernism, but yeah, I know with the, we went to speak to some scientists in Germany who were concerned about the replication crisis, and we had to say that's a different kind of problem to the one that we were looking at. But my main concern at the moment is that science is going to get undermined by postmodernism as a white and Western and masculine way of knowing. So I think it's down to the scientists to make arguments, make methods to improve their own ability to get at objective truth. And I don't think I'd be very qualified to say how that would work. Oh, what exactly is a meta-narrative? Yeah, sorry. So Nick Shaw is asking this now. A meta-narrative is one of those big overarching stories where everything ties in together and it's all very satisfying. So Christianity is a meta-narrative because it gives us our purpose, our goals, why everything is here. Marxism is a meta-narrative because it understands everything in terms of capital and class systems. So anything that just explains large phenomena in a way that's that provides kind of closure and purpose. What we're looking at now with social justice activism is a meta-narrative. That's how it works.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you. Can I just ask one slight nuanced thing about that? Is that okay or no? It's okay. I just wanted to ask.
Hello?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask. Thank you, I appreciate that explanation. I just wanted to ask, you know, like Jordan Peterson's whole idea about logos, is that a meta-narrative then? But maybe that's off the topic. I just wondered if that's the same thing.
Jordan Peterson, I've read Maps of Meaning, but I haven't read a lot of his work. But yes, he is very much about meta-narratives. I would say that's the problem he has mostly with postmodernism, is because he thinks there is a kind of wisdom, a kind of truth in mythic narratives that that we can get some kind of wisdom from. So I disagree with him when it comes down to the nature of truth, because he accepts that objective truth exists, but he accepts that there's another kind of truth which isn't objective. He calls it the affective reality of the mythic world. Now that really is, it's quite postmodern in its way of understanding everything as tied up in meta-narratives. Now for Peterson, it's Jung that's underlying that, and that's much more like Lacan, who's another psychotherapist who takes a more postmodern route. So Peterson shares with the postmodernists this idea that truth can be constructed in language, although he doesn't deny scientific objective truth as well. So I differ with him there, while sort of agreeing with a lot of his criticisms of the the sort of utterly deconstructive, the rejection of science and the control of speech. So I hope that was clear. I think I got into the weeds a bit there.
No, that was good. I think it's great if you go into the weeds, Helen. I think the amount of study that you've done of some of these figures, I think, is really worth sharing with us. So I was going to ask, which of the postmodernists do you respect the most, or are any of them are there any of them that you enjoy reading or got a lot from?
Well, Foucault is the most straightforward to read. And there are some bits of him, I like the idea of his panopticon. I think he made some sense there, because in a lot of his work, but I think in Discipline and Punish, he's looking at the way we changed from horrible, gruesome, horrific punishments in front of an audience to this kind of surveillance where people are all policing each other. And so I really think he made a lot of sense there, but he then goes into such a sort of radically skeptical way of looking at things that it isn't really very useful. But I think I like best Francois Lyotard, because after he'd written The Postmodern Condition, in which he was describing rather than prescribing that we start regarding everything as narratives that we should be skeptical of, this book had so much influence. And then a few years later, bless him, he came up and he said, that was the worst thing I ever wrote. I don't know what I was thinking. People don't, but of course, you know, he doesn't believe in his own work anymore. That doesn't mean other people shouldn't. But yeah, I have a soft spot for him.
Yeah, thank you. So, David Gabbard. You're muted. Yep.
I'm going to mute myself here.
Great.
Helen, don't you think it's a little ironic that DiAngelo and others would rely on Foucault's analysis of knowledge power, while their own discourse has gained ascendancy within the mainstream media and has been mobilized, and I think literally mobilized, in service to establishment institutions? I mean, for example, the Democrat Party here in the United States. How do you explain this ascendancy of critical race theory to some degree of dominance at this particular juncture in history?
This is where they've quite explicitly diverged from the postmodernists. So the first lot have said, you know, we deconstruct everything. We just can't say anything is true. Then the next lot in about 1990 said, well, if we're going to address any kind of oppression, we have to say there are these people here who have these consistent experiences, so we can actually address that. As we've got further on, DiAngelo and her like, they're so far away from the original postmodernists now that they're not at all worried about having developed a meta-narrative of their own. Of course, what you get from social justice activists is a complete denial that they are a dominant narrative of any kind. When they accuse people of trying to maintain the status quo, they're not talking about themselves. But yeah, to the rest of us, it really is quite clear that this is now a dominant narrative. I mean, to her credit, Judith Butler, who's one of the worst, she actually predicted that this could happen. She asked people not to try to make any kind of framework or define these sort of post-structuralist ideas, because they could become exactly what they've become. DiAngelo, I think, and her ilk, they just believe that they're correct. If you look at her language in White Fragility, and the best book of all is Everyone Really Equal, there's words like fact and true and absolute, and you know, she's yeah, if you were to say to her that what she's got is a meta-narrative, I don't think she'd be able to actually deny that.
Jochen, you had a follow-up question to the DiAngelo point. Would you like to?
Yeah, so Helen, I'm curious, if you now imagine Robin DiAngelo was on the call, or let's say not she herself, but someone who has read her book, who has absorbed it and really kind of like is fully steeped in that kind of like self-righteous, left-leaning knowledge of like, I need to reform myself and I need to tell everyone about it, and like I'm so full of white fragility, and every time so they're really full of this. What are the first couple things that you tell someone like that? Like, in a conversation? Like, is there, I mean, and you said it before a little bit, right? By not arguing against it, but rather trying to go to the heart of the argument. But like, how do you do that? If you ever tried and succeeded?
I have spoken. I had an ongoing conversation with somebody who was very, very embedded in queer theory and trans activism, and we got somewhere there where she was quite receptive to me trying to meet her part way and saying, I agree, you know, if we look at sexuality, first of all, it was a sin for hundreds of years, then it was a disorder, now it's some people are gay, get over it. We know that there are narratives out there and they influence how we think about things. But what about you as an individual? Do you have your own mind? Can you evaluate things? Of course, you're not, you know, you can't stand outside society. But if you're looking at everything now and you're seeing these systems of power and you're concerned that other people can't see them, is there a possibility that other people can see things differently? If you can try and get a little bit of doubt in there, I haven't, with somebody who is really, really embedded in the system, I haven't had much success. But what I think there are a lot more people who are sympathetic to the idea. There's this kind of Mott and Bailey thing going on where, you know, the most reasonable understanding of postmodernism is don't accept things uncritically, be skeptical, realize that culture really has an impact on people and that there are different power dynamics. Yes, we can all accept that, but where do we go after that? The people who are tending to go for this quite simplistic narrative of patriarchy, cis normativity and white supremacy, they're the people we have to try and catch and say, it's not that simple. We've got to try and look at things with more nuance, more layers, because the two big lies that the postmodernists, that the social justice activists will tell is first that they are new and radical and edgy rather than being an orthodoxy that's been building for 50 years now. And oh, I've lost my train of thought.
Maybe as a mini follow-up question, have you ever tried pointing out that if you just replace in the text of, let's say, DiAngelo or someone like her, white and black, it sounds incredibly racist in the actual, like in the accepted version, and that it just like, it would be incredibly like offensive to publish something with literally the same content where you just replace white and black. And it's just like, it sounds so awful. And still that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, that you are seeing things this way. And this is what I mean about the way people are tempted to push back. To say, yes, swap it round, look how racist it looks. But this is because you're working on universal liberalism and this idea of reciprocity. Treat me the way you want to be treated. Now, the postmodernists have addressed this at length and at every stage. So there is great long breakdowns of why we can't have this consistent thing. I won't make assumptions about you because you're white. You don't make assumptions about me because I'm black. Let's treat each other as individuals. And what they would say to you if you said that was, you are embedded in this white male Western liberal thing. You have the privilege to see yourself as an individual and to see things as a level playing field, when actually there are these systems of power. Black people can't be racist, women can't be sexist, because of the way the power goes. It's all resistance to it. And that is getting more and more pronounced. I think it was Reddit the day before yesterday, was it, who said their hate speech only applied to insults for minorities and not majorities. And now consistently liberal principles are what you're arguing for and what I think the majority of us still want. So what we've got to do is find a way to hold on to wanting that, but recognizing that putting it to them in those terms are just going to make them think you are not woke, you're not woke to this power system, and then they will just assert that they exist again.
Yeah, I wondered, Helen, did you see the article by Oliver Traidi, I think, about, because there is a backlash, like there's a growing backlash against DiAngelo. And I'm seeing sort of even, I think Glenn Greenwald posted something, so even sort of people on the left are starting to push back. But Oliver Traidi wrote a really interesting article for Arc Digital where he pointed out it's a lot easier to push back against DiAngelo because she's white, and all of the other. So in a way, she's sort of a convenient punching bag for a lot of people who probably would feel scared about making the same criticisms of Ibram Kendi or maybe Ta-Nehisi Coates or one of those writers. What do you make of that?
I think there's, it certainly is easier within that narrative to criticize somebody who's white, but we're seeing as well, one really interesting thing is that people, a lot of Black feminists have told people to stop reading DiAngelo. They've argued there's an essay called The Whiteness of White Fragility Theory, because it really is quite narcissistic. It's all about white people thinking about their own feelings, centering themselves, trying to grow, trying to learn. And this doesn't actually have a lot to do with Black people who would like you to get on board with, helping sort out racism. So what I found really interesting is that when I can't remember, there's one particular Black feminist, and a lot of white people came back at her saying, I can read other books as well, but I just want to read this. And they were really defending DiAngelo against the Black feminist, and that isn't how it's supposed to work. It's not how it's supposed to work in DiAngelo's theory. So I think we are going to see quite a division. There's the sort of pure DiAngelo version, which is the pure Foucault, the pure postmodern. And then we've got Ibram Kendi, and he is not actually doing that. He's not really doing the postmodern thing at all. He is understanding people as individuals, as a shared humanity. I still think he gets things very, very wrong, but he's on the materialist side. So he's looking at evidence, but he's cherry picking it. But he has said it is wrong to say that white people can't help but be racist. It is wrong to be racist against white people, and it's possible to be. So I actually have some hopes of Kendi that he could help push back at some of this postmodern thing if we can get people listening to him a bit more, but also seeing the flaws with him. Just read Thomas Jefferson Williams. I think that's what you should all be doing.
Yeah, I had an interview with Thomas on the channel a couple of days ago, if people haven't seen it. Really interesting conversation.
Yeah, he's a humanist. I like humanists.
Yes. Adriana, would you like to comment? I think the Brazilian perspective is really interesting because I've been sort of struck by the differences between the American and Brazil, which has a very similar history of slavery. If you actually look at there's these animations that show kind of the incredible human toll and human cost, and Brazil actually had far more slaves imported than America did, which I was really shocked at when I saw that. But I'm interested in why. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I'm interested in why Brazil doesn't seem to be kind of riven by the same criticism that America seems to on such a regular basis.
I'm just, are you asking me? just to clarify. Yeah. Okay. So I have lots of assumptions, but I'm not sure. So one of them is that Brazil is developmentally earlier than America as a center of gravity of the country. So I think we haven't got there yet. I think that will come. I think I think we don't have the individuated mind yet so much as a culture, and therefore the group mentality prevails much more. So it's much more. So it's that's one of my guesses. But I think my question was around, when I go to Brazil, so my partner is English, and when I go to Brazil, there's a lot of things that are invisible to my eye. They're actually not invisible anymore because of being outside of Brazil for so long. But to a lot of people I am with and I relate with, there's some things that I haven't read Robin, so I don't know if I can speak to that, but just from what I got from this conversation, I was just thinking that there were invisible things, even to me, when I'm embedded in culture, and I can pluck myself out of Brazil, and then I can come back in. So it's really easy to keep seeing more of myself and my dynamics. But my friends, they are immersed, steeped in that culture, and they've lived like that their whole lives, and they're good people, and they do good things, and it's really hard to unpick. It's really hard for them to see their own racism, because you've been doing that forever. So that's what I was picking a little bit. If there was, when you say about Robin that she doesn't see other perspectives, I was just questioning that maybe, you know, if we put developmental stages in that, if somebody's coming from an expert developmental stage, they won't be able to see other perspectives. I mean, that's a characteristic of the expert developmental stage. So, but that doesn't mean that the experts are all wrong. The expert sometimes can pick some thread or something that feels true in culture. So I was just wondering if there could be something that she's speaking to that's pointing to a blindness in some levels, and then it's taken to the extreme because there's no other people offering other perspectives and not attacking, or, you know, that kind of.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's the case with almost every one of the core ideas in social justice theory that have become so dominant. There's an essay that I've written, it comes from a talk, which is what social justice gets right. And then I'm looking at those truths in the core of it, and then how it's going wrong with them. So with this one, as you're saying, people are embedded in the culture. They don't know what they don't know. This is a perfectly true observation. If I'd been born 500 years ago, I'd almost certainly be a Christian. I'd almost certainly have strong ideas of gender roles. I'd almost certainly believe that homosexuality was a sin because of the culture. But we are in this place now, all of us together, where we are looking at culture, we are looking at assumptions, and there are different ways of getting at them. So if we've got the social justice people who can argue for invisible systems of power to such an extent that they're overwhelming, there's also the liberal idea of the marketplace of ideas. Now, we had such a rapid improvement in women's rights, LGBT rights, racial equality from 1950 until the end of the 80s. Things changed hugely. Now, this was a liberal process. This was people coming together with different ideas, arguing them out. And this is how we made progress. So I will argue that the marketplace of ideas is the way to try and unsettle those assumptions and cultural narratives that we may not really have thought about before. To get at them in the best way, we need to allow different viewpoints and to make arguments. The social justice way, it's radically skeptical and it's chosen one interpretation. And then it surrounds itself with a mechanism that any kind of criticism or disagreement proves that. So it's not taking place in the marketplace of ideas. What they should do, if they believe that this whiteness really does infect everybody to an extent that they can't see, is argue this out. And this is how we would get there in the end. I know that sometimes that sounds a bit naive, thinking we'll always come up with the best ideas, but that has been how it's worked out generally. I think the best book on this is Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors, and he follows how quickly anti-Semitism and homophobia was overcome because of people being allowed to argue for them. And so I think I think there is that core of truth. It is almost certainly true that a lot of white people, if they're confronted with the aftermath of racism, the physical impact of racism, they're going to feel very uncomfortable. People are going to want to change the subject. She's not wrong to say that there is a discomfort with this kind of cultural guilt. But I think she goes quite wrong after that, where she's, you know, really only she and a few chosen others are aware of this, and you just can't get at it and talk to it.
And that she charges you £6,000 an hour, $6,000 an hour for that as well.
I said it was 12, and then someone showed me that it's 20 to 30,000 or something for an interview now, for a lecture.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's a good business model, definitely. Leilani, you had a follow-up question on this. You'd like to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, thank you. I have a lot of people around me that are not really, their basic source of news is the evening news, 5:30 to 6 p.m. My understanding is, I've watched a few YouTubes on like the intractability of people's beliefs, especially their moral beliefs, how tied it is to their identity, and how I think it sounds like there's an assumption that some people, or a lot of people, are thinkers. They really do stop and think and reflect on a lot of this stuff instead of sort of like just going with whatever their kind of like enculturated beliefs already are. And it seems like I think we need some better ways to like engage with them. I actually did buy your book, the Impossible Conversations. I watched the video and I loved it.
Yeah, that's Jim and Peters, yeah.
Yeah, and so it just seems to me that there's a way to engage with people, and I'm not skilled at all about this.
I think we need a change of culture at the moment. I'm trying to encourage people, if they're talking in social media or whatever, to actually say, I disagree with you on almost everything, but you just made a really good point. Or, if you're going to criticize a social justice belief, also give some credit to the truth in it. I think we need to try and get this kind of conversation, an expectation that there will be charitable readings, that you will try to meet someone where they are as far as you can. But how to actually go about changing that, I just see it increasing polarization and narrowness, and people shutting themselves down. And I have this kind of naive hope, and it's because I'm an early modernist, and there was, the Book of Common Prayer. So after the Catholics and the Protestants and the wars of religion, and it just went back and forth, and about during the reign of Elizabeth I, she said, we're going to have this Book of Common Prayer, and it was phrased so broadly that a Catholic could read it and a Protestant could read it, and neither of them would have to go against their beliefs, because there was just this strong need among the British public to have some peace, to try and find some middle ground, to not have these wars. So I'm really hopeful. I think our best bet is if the liberal conservatives and the liberal lefties try and talk to each other and each marginalise the extremists who are closed to all other ideas on their own side. The piece that we wrote about that was called the Manifesto Against the Enemies of Modernity, where we have asked people not to identify as left or right, but to identify as supporters of evidence, of reason, of liberalism, in that broadest philosophical sense, and to try and push back the extremists on both sides so the grown-ups can talk to each other.
I think that's a kind of a key piece, is the grown-ups can talk. I think I really, along with developmental theory, I think there's a lot of people that haven't.
Yeah.
According to Integral, they're not.
You see a lot of childishness, don't you? With the kind of argumentation, there is a real childishness, and sometimes from people with PhDs, and they're just twisting words and being snarky. And I think, you're a professor of whatever, and people are watching you, and you're acting like you're in the playground. We need to have an expectation that will damage someone's reputation again, I think.
Thank you.
So, Andrew Scott, you had a bit of a curveball of a question. Do you want to ask Helen?
Yeah, sure. So I keep seeing a lot of weird parallels in my historical understanding of esoteric schools and weird cult figures from the early 1900s and the 1950s, like Aleister Crowley, in his, do as thou wilt, that is the whole of the law, this spiritual understanding of powers that you can take on and then make your own power, and that's really the only objective truth. And I also draw a lot of parallels between, we seem to be almost in this kind of a dark age of information where there's so much information that nobody knows what's true. And in the same way that in the 1930s, the Germans were employing esoteric ideas to try to manipulate the public in this vacuum of trustworthy information. And I wonder if the postmodernists, if they show any evidence of having taken or borrowed from some of those ideas to try to weaponize it in a way that will sway the public to their own ends.
I think there's sort of two things that are coming out of that, and they're both very much to do with human nature rather than, I think, an evolution of ideas. So, I mean, you're talking about these ideas around power and taking power, and we've got this kind of counter-enlightenment thing going on in every generation. There's always something which isn't satisfied with science, with reason. There's something that wants to be mystical and emotional and intuitive, and push back at that. And then we have this constant propaganda campaigns. I mean, this is what humans do throughout history. Anytime you're looking back, you're finding some people that are using the power of language to influence. I mean, if you look, for example, at Othello, and we have Iago and his use of language. Now, Shakespeare was writing this at this time because of the court of Elizabeth I. That has got this very sort of Machiavellian double layers sort of rhetoric thing going on at the same time. And I don't know that, I think the postmodernists' influences are that the Marxists to a certain extent, the surrealists and the modernists. So they're acting in reaction, in opposition, rather than, I think, a sort of continuation. You can take them back to Hegel, of course, but mostly they kind of made a break with everything that they saw in modernity. I think Marxism had failed, and that was the main narrative for the people on the left. They saw it as having failed because it was a meta-narrative. And I think you can understand postmodernism best if you understand it as an overthinking of, well, if Marxism doesn't work, nothing is real, nothing can work.
That's great. Do you think that it's inevitable that you're going to get more pushback from those I forget how you described it, but the counter position, the stronger that you have the reigning orthodox ideology, you're going to get that much more pushback inevitably?
I think there's always going to be a kind of human nature that isn't satisfied with the material, with science or with reason. So religion has taken a lot of this. But I mean, even in religion, we had the people like Aquinas who were codifying things, who were trying to work things out with reason. And then you have the mystics. So I think the postmodernists are a form of mystic, of counter-enlightenment, of emotional, intuitive pushback that we're going to see in our generation. Now we've got the same thing right now with things like research justice. That's a drive to include as research things like religious stories, traditions, feelings, experiences. They're saying researchers gathering data is a white Western thing. So there's always these two things at war with each other. And I think, we have to try, people like me, people who are what you'd say very loosely enlightenment values, have to try and hold that ground. And we've got the benefit because it actually works.
Thank you.
Great. And Ryan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Sure. So I see a lot of times, people go to protests, they participate in like the woke church and, say, I've sinned, forgive me kind of thing. And then they kind of go home and be like, yes, I've done my part. I've changed the world. I don't have to do anything else. So the problem really happens when like people start taking like action, right? So we make some kind of law, or we, like in the United States, try to dismantle the police, things that actually can be destructive long term. So I'm curious how much you think it's really just kind of noise and kind of waving your arms and screaming versus like concern for actual long-term change that will happen out of some of these movements.
I think there is a definite problem with theories that come from postmodernism of not having a clear end game. So whereas with the Marxists, that there was a goal, that the workers would own the means of production, everything would work out nicely and evenly. And there's that totalitarian element. But with social justice, with its postmodern roots, we're still very much picking things apart, doing interpretations of language. And this is what the Marxist scholars criticize the postmodernists for. They say you're not actually doing anything, you are navel gazing, it's self-indulgent, it's performative, and you're just pulling things apart, looking at language, looking at sort of power structures. It's bourgeois, is what the Marxists would say about it. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, because a lot of the people who are protesting and a lot of the people who are leading this are upper middle class white people. This is very much a wealthy, elite, university-based, activist-based movement.
I'd like to ask you something, Helen, about that you touched on a little bit in the interview that you did before, but just a little bit of the backstory with the New Atheism movement, because I understand that it was it was one of the first kind of casualties of this as an ideology, and it seems that there's quite a lot of yourself, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, Sam Harris, all of you kind of come from this sort of new atheist background, and have and also this sort of sense of being very aware of what religions look like.
Yeah, I think that there is that, but within the new atheist movement, there was really always two movements, because there was the skeptics, the people who were really concerned with what is true and how we know what is true. And then there were the political activists, and they were concerned about what religion was doing to women's rights and to LGBT rights. So obviously both groups cared about both, in theory at least, but the schism came with the sort of difference between the skeptics and the morally motivated. So the social justice activists, they came from the new atheists in some way, but they came from this kind of activist moral stance, whereas those of us who were really interested in epistemology, how we know what is true, they went off in the other direction, and so we're now almost entirely opposed. So yeah, for us, for James and Peter and me, we're consistently doing the same thing. The problems we had with religion were that they were making truth claims without evidence, and there was illiberal ethics that were judging people by their gender or by their sexuality. So now we're looking at social justice and postmodern ideas, and that's really the same kind of thing. We're still seeing claims, anti-scientific ideas, a lack of evidence, illiberal ethics, not treating people equally. So it's a kind of resurgence of the same thing, except that when we were criticizing religion, and because of where we were geographically, it was mostly Christianity, we were recognized as being decidedly left-wing. Now that we're criticizing social justice, we've suddenly become far-right extremists, according to the popular narrative.
And Coach Constance, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi there. Thank you, Helen, for joining us and all your knowledge. It's really wonderful. So I have have one perception of mine recently is the conflicts of all the different groups and the riots escalating each year here. I'm not that familiar with the rest. Seem to be like falling right in line with the Marx manifesto of the steps that it'll go to get to their end goal or the end goal. And I was wondering if you agree or have thoughts on. It seems now, because for me it's been building for, I saw it building for a long time, but it seems now there's people coming out because they're like, okay, I supported a lot of this ideology, but now they're coming for me, and now it's stepping on my toes. So now I will talk about DiAngelo. I will kind of push back. And do you see any of that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that there were two things there that you were saying that it was following, the protests were following a kind of Marxist structure, and then I wasn't sure what the second thing you were saying. People are pushing back against DiAngelo. I wasn't sure how that.
In the Communist Manifesto, he says, I think it's in part 2, these are the steps that you might want to take, and it has that there'll be a combination of, and I call I don't use bourgeois in the other word, because to me I want to talk more, get in the habit of talking more to common folk like me. So it seems like I guess he considers them peasants. The more the economy breaks down, which is happening now to extreme, the more there's peasants, the more they can gather the power of that mindset of us versus them, and the more the riots will escalate regardless of why they're escalating, and there won't be a certain head of what's going on with the organizations. Like the BLM is spread all across America, and that there'll be multiple factions that are trying to like get the power of what's going on. Like it seems like there's the Antifa, there's the BLM, there's the this, there's the that, and that's part of the cycle. And that part of the cycle too is I think he even uses the word social democrat, and that like the example of the couple, I don't know if you saw it, that had the guns protecting their property, and that they're part of the steps of it because they're in the mindset of what he talks about, where you get to the social justice, social democrats, but we'll keep our land individually. And then the next step is they're not liking now that it's now getting to that point where now it's time for them to get to the next level. And so it seems to me there are people that have been thinking all along, and then now they're speaking out. Like, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place because I've been thinking about this for days. So like Brett Weinstein, when it happened to him at Evergreen, it was like he was kind of in that narrative, but it was like cold water in his face because it showed up on his doorstep idea, and he talks about that. And now which is great. I'm all for people changing their minds at any point, or going either direction at any point. But it seems like recently, because we're a little far down the line here, people are speaking out, but because they've shown up at, like, the conflict is showing up on their doorstep.
Okay, so I think yeah, we've got, if we're looking at the kind of culture of the social justice and how that connects with the kind of Marxist views, there's a flavour that is similar. So we've got Marcuse, who's a post-Marxist. Obviously, he came away from Marx's idea looking at economy. He's looking more at culture. He's talking about taking over the institutions, but he was still very much in an intellectual space. Then they had the rise of the New Left, and they have taken some of Marcuse's ideas and they're putting them towards revolution, although Marcuse wasn't very happy about that. So we've got that current coming, Marx, Marcuse, New Left, into social justice, but there's not a lot of the intellectual framework of Marxism in there. There's a revolutionary spirit. There's a concept of hegemony, you know, the powerful narratives in society. But otherwise, it works quite differently from the Marxist thing. I think this is much more chaotic. There's been people who are agitating for change, but nothing really progressive, you know, nothing in any kind of organized way. They've been winning the culture wars.
Well, from the Marxist Manifesto, he actually, to me, it was clearly addressed that he predicts that that's what will be happening. There will be these people with these kind of intentions that don't even have a plan for Marxism or communism or any of that, but they're part of what he predicted would be in the favor of the outcome of socialism to the extreme of communism.
Yeah, there's a revolutionary spirit, certainly, and I think we can think of it in a similar way to as we saw Marxism in the UK. It really was sort of touch and go for a while, whether there was going to be a revolution. There wasn't one, there was a reform instead of employment laws. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is an attempt at a cultural revolution. I think a lot of people who have been hedging their bets are now having to pick a side. And so it could, you know, the next few months are going to be very, very interesting. But I'd be careful of trying to tie it in too closely to anything Marx said. There's quite a lot of stuff in there where he's got a good understanding of human nature, and he's got the revolutionary spirit. But I don't think that the way he was writing in the Communist Manifesto really sort of is that connected to what we're seeing right now, apart from this revolutionary sort of zeal, which doesn't really have that much of a focus. It just wants to pull everything apart at the moment.
So we're almost at the end. I was just going to, Jochen, you had a thought maybe to ask Helen if there is anything that she needs in terms of support. And Helen, I was going to invite you to just share any resources or I know you mentioned the Discord server earlier on, or just anything that you would sort of direct people towards. Jochen, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think, David, you put it already fairly well. Like, is there anything, Helen, that you can think of us on this call, or Rebel Wisdom, maybe if David makes this recording available to members, that you think we can do to help? Because I somehow have the sense that you're pretty exhausted at times with how much pushback you're getting.
Yeah, and I mean, at the moment, the purpose of the Discord is to try and get people who are really quite vulnerable in their positions of work and not in a good place to fight back on their own, try to connect them with senior people in their field and also with people who understand the scholarship and activism. So I would say to anybody watching this, please send to me anybody who is in trouble and anybody who can help anybody who is in trouble. And I really hope that I can try and bring these two things together and have a kind of organized resistance. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And the other thing I would direct people towards is is it New Discourses? Is that the name of the site, yeah. Helen?
New Discourses is James Lindsay's site, and it's a wonderful, wonderful resource in there is the encyclopedia. There he's defining, using their own terms, what certain jargon words mean, and then unpicking them from the outside. So it's a really good way to get an education on that. He's amazing the amount of stuff he can put out.
Yeah, it's very thorough, very, very well put together. So yeah, highly recommend that. So thank you so much for making the time, Helen. And the questions were excellent. We've recorded this, we'll put it on for our members. And I'm going to invite everyone to unmute themselves, and as is traditional, just to say thank you to Helen, and we'll close the call with some thumbs up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Doing great
work.
fight.